So good afternoon, everybody. So before I talk about the honest broker, I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors on this paper. Try again. There, too far, of course. So since I've previewed a little bit here, what I'm going to talk about, I'll go over sort of the motivation of why we developed an electronic honest broker in the first place, in particular how it relates to some of our biorepository efforts at CHOP and the need to scale those up in an NCI best practices compliant manner. I'll give a little definition of what I mean by an electronic honest broker in this context. Of course, I'll talk about our implementation, the data model, the API service, and I'll come back to the biorepository portal and show how we're using our electronic honest broker. So our primary motivation is that we have a need at CHOP, that we have a lot of biorepository, biobanking programs going on, and in particular we have a need to scale those. And so we've got some which are longitudinal, so data is being collected over multiple temporal times. And this diagram here, kind of starting from left to right, this sort of indicates sort of a general longitudinal biobanking collection process. And so on the far left, we see that a subject gets consented onto the program, and then there's a multitude of collection events, sample collection, data collection. These things can occur in any particular order, so it's asynchronous. And then that data has to get into a de-identified repository, both sample data and associated coded data. So this large quote that I have on here is from the NCI best practices for biorepository portals. And the portion in red basically indicates that the sample data should be associated with some sort of coded health data in a de-identified data storage system. So that's achievable enough, and that's not so bad. But the other part, which is in blue, is that it should be also, there should be a maintenance of an association between the subject identifiers, name, their medical record number, or whatever their unique record identifier is at that institution, with this encoded data to enable longitudinal collection in the biorepository portal. And so this is where I've got this blue question mark, because how do you implement that in a manner that is consistent with protecting patient privacy data? So you can do it with a manual or human honest brokers, but the challenge with that is it typically doesn't scale very well. In fact, that's what we had been doing at CHOP prior to this. It really increases the time required to collect samples and information, and so we were looking for a better way. So this idea of an electronic honest broker, at least as applies to this, I think of this as a computing system that securely maintains the link between the patient information and some set, one or more, of research record IDs and clinical record IDs for records related to that patient in some other external system, which is most likely de-identified. And in our application, we want to think of this system as being able to enable context-based access to that information. So the presumption is that the honest broker is going to maintain this link on this information, but we don't really know how that information needs to be used. It's going to depend on the particular context. Biorepository being one context, but there may be other contexts, so we don't want to constrain that access up front necessarily. So the model we've developed is a REST-based web service model, so this isn't necessarily revolutionary. I mean, there's obviously plenty of REST-based models out there, but this is sort of a very simple overview. The electronic honest broker is sitting on the far right-hand side of this. Somewhere there's a cloud where people can make internet requests. The electronic honest broker itself communicates to the encrypted database where the links between the subject information, the subject identifying information, and the record IDs are maintained. And somewhere, shown on the left here, is a client application. And so I'll come back to that, but for now let me just say that the client application can make requests to electronic honest broker to find the information that's contained associating record links to a particular subject. So I'm going to dive into our model a little bit here. I don't have time to go terribly far into it, but the data model in the electronic honest broker is represented here, at least the important parts. So the part on the bottom in red represents effectively there's a subject. Associated with that subject is an organization, so we can think of, say, Jane Doe at CHOP, and then there's a series of records associated with that subject, and these are record IDs in some external system. So in our case, it happens to be a REDCap database and a LIMS sample management database. So you can think of this as looking like a table, which is what I'm showing to the right here, where each row in the table is a subject and their associated IDs. And it's sort of simple enough to think about it in that way. The top part, which is in blue, this is to provide some granularity over control of the records and the subjects so that these clients they're talking to the electronic honest broker can in some way protect the records that are in there, in the sense of they can put them in a group, the records themselves, or they can assign the subjects to a group, and there's a couple of keys, one assigned by the electronic honest broker and one assigned by the client, which enables the system to say, well, other clients that don't know those keys can't either access those records or alter those records in some way. And again, you can think of that as being representing a table where each row in a table is a group with the associated subjects or records. So that's the data model. Now, the REST service itself, for those of you who aren't familiar with standard sort of REST services, I'll bring this out a little bit more. So again, the client now is on the far left, and again, we have this presumption that we don't really know what the client needs to do with this EHB data. So the client is responsible for determining the context in which the data will be used. What it is allowed to do is access resources on the electronic honest broker. So those resources are things like the subject, external records associated with the subject, and they can use standard REST methods like get, post, put, and delete to update those records, access the records, and of course delete them. Now, the electronic honest broker, which is sitting here on the right-hand side, its responsibility is, one, first to determine authorization. Is this application even allowed to access the service in the first place? Assuming it is, then there's some granularity, like I said, over what that application may be able to do, but assuming it's allowed to do what it's doing, then go ahead and query the database or access the database, manipulate the data, et cetera, and provide a formatted response back to the client based on its original request. So that's the electronic honest broker model, which we've implemented. And so if I come back to the biorepository, we have this sort of large-scale biorepository program going on at CHOP, which is now leveraging the electronic honest broker. And so the biorepository is a client application, though that system that I was showing to the far left that was sort of hypothetical in the model. And in this case, it provides a unified interface for those individuals who are collecting the specimen and sample data in that longitudinal manner to put that data into these de-identified systems. In our case, again, it's a REDCap database and a Nautilus LIMS system, laboratory information management system. And so the biorepository portal leverages the electronic honest broker to enable this longitudinal data collection and the sample collection, with the person collecting the data only ever needing to know the subject by name and medical record number at CHOP. They never actually have access to the research IDs for those records associated in REDCap and Nautilus. And so this provides us with more efficient workflows. We don't have to send, involve a human honest broker, and it scales for effectively the same reason because it's all being handled electronically. So this is what the interface looks like to the biorepository portal. So the research coordinator or clinician who's collecting the data, they log in, assuming they have credentials on a particular protocol, they access that biobanking protocol, and they are presented with a list of patients who are already on this protocol. And from there, they can select one of different things on these action buttons. The one I've highlighted is health data, and that actually goes out and talks to the EHB to get the REDCap record number associated with this patient on this protocol, then talks to REDCap, gets the forms that are available for this protocol, and presents them to the user, again, without the user ever knowing what the research record ID in REDCap was. And the sample data does a similar thing with LIMS, the Nautilus LIMS system. So I sort of talked very quickly over what that means, so I'm going to kind of peek behind that a little bit further. So the way this works, I don't know how I'm doing it. Okay, great. So the research coordinator, and this could be a clinician collecting the sample, this could be the research coordinator collecting the coded data that goes with that sample, and they are different people in our particular biobanking effort. They make a request to the biorepository portal system for a record. So they've selected in that list I showed subject Jane Doe, and I want their health data. Now, they don't know, they can't go directly to REDCap and get that because REDCap works with a de-identified record ID, so just knowing the patient name and MRN wouldn't get them anywhere in that system. So the biorepository portal, step 2 here, goes to the electronic honest broker. Biorepository portal has a bunch of information. In particular, it knows the patient's name, it knows the medical record number, it knows that the system it wants to look on is REDCap. Asks the honest broker, effectively, do you have a record associated with that information? It turns out that it does. The honest broker returns that record ID to the biorepository portal. That's step 3 here. The biorepository portal at that point goes out and talks to the REDCap system. So here is making a request to an external system, which is for using the record ID, which now that record gets returned, and then consequently the record is displayed to the user, again, without the user ever having to know what that research ID was in the REDCap system. And the Nautilus system works effectively in the same way. So that is a very fast and furious overview of what the electronic honest broker and the associated biorepository portal do. I would argue that it increases patient privacy while also still being flexible and allowing consistency across systems, and it's obviously scalable in the sense that without the need to route all this stuff through a human honest broker, it happens on the fly. So.